Their deep battle seeks the destruction and dislocation of the Ukrainian military, economic and industrial potential to the point when the willpower of the Ukrainians to resist is shattered and smashed. The key thing today is that we've learned that the Americans are giving another $400 million worth of military aid that will be announced probably today, which is more Patriot and NASAMS, that's surface-to-air missile defense systems, more air defense missiles, therefore, more guided artillery, more explosives for mine clearance. And it's those things which will aid the Ukrainians in gaining more territory. Now, again, the statistics which we've had this week is that over the last week in the south, in Zaporizhia province, that 12 square kilometers have been retaken, and that since the counteroffensive, 192 square kilometers have been retaken. Now, in a way, that is not a metric of any value. Of course, it's the outcome of wars which are important, not the number of square kilometers that you've taken on any particular week or since the offensive. And my key worry still is that if we're something like D plus 49 of the counteroffensive at the moment, the breakout from Normandy in 1944 only began at D plus 55. And that was in a situation where the Allies had absolutely overwhelming aerial power. And that is a thing that Ukraine does not have. That is why that they have to take a very steady incremental look at this, because there is a difference, again, as General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in America this week, between war on paper and the real war. And the war on paper said that Ukraine would have an advance of X kilometers over Y week. In reality, because it's real people dying in real minefields, that has reduced. And you'd expect it to be reduced in those situations when you don't have that air superiority. Well, there were 4 factors for success in land operations in 20th century warfare. The first one was control of the air. The second one was shock. The third, surprise. And the fourth, offensive recce. If you take both ends of that spectrum, you've got the Ukrainians trying to do offensive recce and pull their forces through, when at the same time control of the air is really with the Russians. And certainly in Zaporizhia, we've got the Russians flying from Berdyans'k, which is where there have been a number of storm shadow strikes on headquarters and an attempt to take out some of the Russian helicopters there. You've got Havoc, Hokum, and Hind flying from there. And it's also worth saying that on the 14th of July, the head of the RAF gave the figures of Russian aircraft which had been destroyed, 86 fixed-wing aircraft destroyed and 90 helicopters. In terms of the Russian inventory, that is not a quantum number, which means that the Russian Air Force is exhausted. So in terms of the framework of the battlefield, we look at the deep battle, which is what Russia is trying to do in severing the grain exports, as it did previously the energy infrastructure of Russia. And at the same time, Ukraine is trying to do that to Russia in terms of both hitting its depots to sustain its forces, trying to have psychological ripples with the population, with the attacks on Moscow, and also to show that the Black Sea can't be a freedom of maneuver for the Russian forces. Now, this is where Odessa really comes in, because really the Sea of Azov has become a Russian lake since the Russians took the southern provinces there, or the coastal parts of the province. And this is what they tried to do really in the initial invasion. So they didn't want to just have a land corridor to Crimea. They wanted a land corridor all the way to Moldova to join up with the Transnistria. So that's strategically where Odessa comes in. And it comes in, of course, with how the grain facilities have been hit, both in Odessa and most recently yesterday with the attacks on Rena on the Danube, which abuts the Romanian border. That is one of the other routes that Ukraine could get its grain at. So it's showing that it doesn't have freedom of maneuver for Russia. That's the importance of the drone attacks on Russian naval assets. Well, it's really, you have to look at how the grain exports flow around the world. So the EU is self-sufficient in grain. The EU is a major global exporter of wheat, for example. The real key thing is that 65% of Russian and Ukrainian grain, wheat, sunflower goes to the developing world. And that's the reason, for example, that the UN Chief Guterres, who's holding a 3-day food security conference at the moment in Rome, is really, really worried about the access to the UN World Food Programme for countries which are on the brink of starvation. And here we're talking about Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, countries, Yemen, countries like that. And that's exacerbated, of course, by the price which goes up if these things happen. Now, from a military perspective, what the Russians have been doing at Odessa and Reni actually makes sense because what the Russians have done very successfully is done a sustained and relentless campaign on Odessa, which has got through the Ukrainian air defense. Now, what has really not been talked about very much before is that in terms of targeting, this is what we call the JPITL, the Joint Prioritized Target List. And they've gone for all those key infrastructures, grain silos, and all those things which help to manage a port very successfully. And they've done this by looking at what they call the munitions effectiveness assessment, the MEA. So you do an attack, you do a battlefield damage assessment, you see what has worked and not worked, and then you re-attack using different profiles. And this is why we've seen both a combination of sort of Iranian drones and cruise missiles, both air-launched cruise missiles, sea-based cruise missiles, and those from the coastal areas of Crimea. And this is why some people have got it wrong when they say that you must give ATACMS now to Ukraine and this will solve the problem. It won't, because those air-launched cruise missiles and sea-launched cruise missiles over a range which is outside the effective range of the ATACMS. The safety and security regimes at Zaporizhzhia NPP have always been under inspection by the IAEA inspectors. Grossi has been there a number of times, the head of IAEA. And again, we get a number of scare stories, but in terms of the integrity of the buildings, the integrity of the water systems, and the integrity of the power supply, which you need to keep the reactors cooled, and most of them are in a cooled state anyway. They are not actively online. This is not an existential threat at the moment or any imminency of a meltdown. We've had a number of maximalist positions over the time. Again, this is the rhetoric of fear by the Russians to scare the international community from not supporting Ukraine. We've resisted that, but part of this has also led to this gradualist approach from the West in the supply of either humanitarian aid or monetary aid or military aid.